Ladies and gentlemen, this is DVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. In this episode, we're diving into a story of geopolitical intrigue, economic entanglement, and one country's struggle to redefine itself in a challenging world. We're talking about Armenia and Tajikistan and their tangled web with Russia, a relationship that's proving harder to break than an old habit. Although Prime Minister Pashinyan is doing the most to figuratively take his country as far from Russia as possible, there's some realities that won't be changed overnight. Meanwhile, despite ethnic tensions, Tajiks continue to have some decades-long economic ties that run deeper than the Moscow metro. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Tax records in Armenia highlight the efforts of local authorities to separate the country's economy from Russia. Armenia is not alone in this predicament. Tajikistan faces a similar challenge of deep economic ties with Russia. Emomali Rahmon, president of Tajikistan, frequently pays official visits to Russia, emphasizing the close relations between the two nations. Similarly, Armenia has difficulties with slipping out of Russia's zone of influence. After Azerbaijan regained Nagorno-Karabakh, the Armenian government tried to distance itself from Russia, and many Armenians believe it failed to fulfill its security obligations aimed at protecting Armenia's interests. Consequently, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan quickly strengthened Armenia's ties with the European Union and the United States. However, although political changes are proceeding quickly, reorienting Armenia's economy away from Russia is proving to be more challenging, given its long-standing focus on Russian markets. Trade with sanctioned Russia has become highly profitable for many Armenian companies, which have adapted to act as intermediaries for Russian consumers cut off from direct access to Western goods. Armenia's trade with Russia surged following the country's invasion of Ukraine, raising suspicions that Armenia might be aiding Russia in evading some of the imposed sanctions. Apart from trade, Russia's influence on Armenia's economy extends through its possession of strategic assets. Gazprom Armenia, a subsidiary of the Russian energy giant, has a monopoly on the country's natural gas supplies. Similarly, the Russian railways control the country's railway network.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Let's start with the basics. Tax records in Armenia have shown a significant challenge for the Armenian government, disentangling the country's economy from Russia. The single largest tax-paying entity in Armenia, records show, is an electronics retailer that appears to generate a large share of its profits from exports to Russia. Since Azerbaijani forces conquered Nagorno-Karabakh, the Armenian government has been on a mission to distance itself from Russia, and let's be real here. Russia failed to uphold its security commitments to defend Armenia's interests. So politically, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has been quick to bolster relations with the European Union and the United States. But while making a political shift is one thing, reorienting an entire economy is another beast altogether. Now, let's shift our focus to another part of the post-Soviet space where Russia's influence loomed large, Tajikistan. The mutual trade between Tajikistan and Russia rose by an impressive 21% in first quarter this year compared to the same period last year. That's a substantial figure for a small nation, and it tells a story of deep economic ties and dependencies. However, value of imports from Russia to Tajikistan are over 20 times higher than the reverse. So this imbalance highlights a crucial point. Russia isn't just Tajikistan's largest trade partner in terms of trade turnover, it's also the republic's key partner in terms of imports. Now, you might wonder why this matters at all. Well, the answer lies in the economic lifeline that remittance provide. Remittances from expatriate Tajikistanis are estimated to account for up to 50% of Tajikistan's GDP. That's right, half of the country's economic stability hinges on money sent back home by Tajiks working abroad, most of whom are in Russia. It's a relationship that significantly shaped Tajikistan's economic policies and its geopolitical stance. Armenia's trade turnover with Russia has skyrocketed since the invasion of Ukraine. Trade with sanctions-stripped Russia has proven highly lucrative for many Armenian businesses. The country has come under wide suspicion of assisting Russia in sanctioned evasion. Last fall, Armenian officials said Russia accounted for almost 40% of Armenia's annual exports. This level of economic interdependence makes any shift away from Russia a complex and challenging endeavor. For Tajikistan, maintaining strong ties with Russia isn't just a matter of diplomacy, it's a necessity for economic survival. And that's just a glimpse of how interconnected and interdependent these relationships can be. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Bruce Pannier, journalist from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So can you first help us understand these deeply entangled economic ties between Russia and the neighboring countries such as Armenia and Tajikistan?
Well, I mean, obviously, this goes back to the Soviet days and probably even before that. But certainly the infrastructure ties are hugely important to these countries, and those were developed during the Soviet time. So roads, railways, pipelines, the means of distribution, all this stuff for more than 7 decades was all decided in Moscow. And then there's a lot of things that Russia provides that countries like Armenia and Tajikistan need and do not have. I'm thinking specifically about oil and natural gas. Both Armenia and Tajikistan are mountainous countries. So they depend on imports for their energy resources, and Russia has been the major exporter of energy to these regions, and for the near future and probably midterm future, there seems to be no substitute for Russia. So they're tied to them, and there's really nothing they can do.
Right, and so that provides us with a very complicated situation now. Like you said, there's pretty much nothing they could do. However, they are trying, well, at least some country are trying to distance itself from these economic ties. Is there any way you can see that realistically be achieved?
Well, to some extent, the process has started. We're at the very early stages. Russia has made itself an international pariah for its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So I think all the countries that occupied the former Soviet space or that are members of the Commonwealth of Independent States are looking for new partners at the moment, seeing that Russia is occupied in Ukraine and that it's not the ally that you really want to walk around town with, so to speak. Because they're not very popular. So, all these countries are reaching out to find new partners, investors, possible trade partners, especially. And they're making some success. But like I said, it's at the early stage. The unfortunate thing was there was a lot of inertia coming out of the Soviet days. Since the system was set up to supply these countries, it was easier to just maintain the systems that were already in place than it was to strike out and make a bold move and start detaching from Moscow and finding out ways that you could be independent of Russia and still satisfy all the needs of your country and your population.
All right, of course, we're talking about natural resources, but some countries like Tajikistan do gain significant amount of their GDP from remittances with Tajiks working inside Russia. Do you think that could be kind of changed anytime soon?
I think that's already changing. Certainly, in the case of Tajikistan, we had the Crocus City Hall terrorist attack in late March, and the suspects have all that Moscow, that the Russian government has named, are all ethnic Tajiks who come from Tajikistan, although many of them were living in Russia for quite a while. The evidence of whether they did it or not is still flimsy, but in the meantime, the Russian population, large segment of it, has become very hostile to Tajiks, which is extremely unfortunate. I mean, more than 1 million Tajik citizens have been working in Russia. And if we look at Tajikistan's population, it's slightly over 10 million. If you consider how many people make up the eligible workforce, 1 million people is probably about 35% of the eligible workforce in Tajikistan. So it's huge, that they need this money from remittances. However, it's been demonstrated many times by the actions of average Russian citizens in a lot of these cities that they feel they don't want the Tajiks there. Tajiks are unwelcome in a lot of places. And that hostility is translated into many Tajiks returning home where there are no jobs. So they're having to look for other places where they can work, or the government is trying to come up with some kind of plan to create more workspaces so that they can accommodate these, really tens of thousands and possibly hundreds of thousands of people who are returning from Russia now.
All right, so how do these countries kind of adapt to these changes? Is there any other places where they can source their economic ties and their GDP?
Yeah, well, certainly, like I said, there's a lot of partners that are coming forward. In the case specifically of Tajikistan, they are fortunate that at this particular moment, critical raw materials are a big topic. Tajikistan, of course, mountainous country, but they contain or they have many of these critical raw materials, so they're getting a lot of attention from a lot of people. The Chinese have been out there doing exploration work in Tajikistan for more than a decade for specifically these kind of things, these kind of minerals. But now we see a lot of interest from Europe, from other countries in Southeast Asia, even from the United States, trying to figure out if maybe there's something there that's usable, that they and can it be mined in Tajikistan and exported to these other markets. So that is a possibility for Tajikistan, that they might be able to find a new sort of El Dorado, I guess you could say, in the minerals in their mountains.
All right, I think caught a very interesting thing you said there, like figuring out if there's something that could be used there. And I was wondering if some of these attempts by Europe or America by reaching out is more of a political decision more than an economic one.
It's both. Obviously, this is in the zero-sum game type of thinking. What you want to do is detach some of these countries from Russia to the greatest extent possible. That's going to be extremely difficult in Tajikistan's case. But if Tajikistan can reach some kind of comfort level where they understand that they have a source of income and certain trade and possibly even security guarantees from other countries, then that makes them less dependent on Russia. And if that's your end goal, then there's a solution there. But concerning the critical raw materials that I was just talking about, this is stuff that these countries really want for themselves. Uranium, for one, thorium. There's a whole list. Tajikistan has practically all the elements on the Mendeleev periodic chart.
What about a situation in Armenia? Do you think that they could pursue the same type of economic strategies?
I don't know how much exploration work is done. Probably a lot. I mean, the Soviet Union, for all its faults, they did send people out to do geological surveying all over the place. So yeah, there are records of what they have in Armenia. I think Armenia would benefit most from its location. I mean, it really is the bridge between Europe and Asia in a lot of ways. So that's probably going to be their biggest asset going forward if they can open up some of these big trade corridors, and if Armenia can patch up ties sufficiently with Azerbaijan, which is one thing, but find a way that they can become part of this bridge that's going between Asia and Europe. That would also, of course, mean that they would have to improve ties greatly with Turkey, which has been difficult since there's a long-standing problem, I'll say, between the two countries at the moment. But Armenia certainly would have a lot to offer. Of course, it is the kind of an eastern outpost of the Christian world. So they might be able to attract some of these countries from Europe and even the United States by just trying to play that card to the greatest extent possible and see if they can't get some extra aid. And let's not forget that was the whole reason that Russia ended up coming into Armenia in the early 19th century. The reason that they gave at the time was that they were a Christian nation and they were there to help out a Christian nation, which happened to be Armenia. So you can't disregard that as a possible asset in Armenia's list of potential benefits for being a trade partner or a partner.
All right. Here's a difficult one for you. How confident are you in these pursuit in decoupling from Russia? And do you think if the Western world will be able to take that as a model if they were to pursue decoupling from China, for example?
Decoupling from China is going to be a lot more difficult. It's going to be, the longer the war goes on in Ukraine, the more all these countries will decouple from Russia. Now, China is a different situation. China has long been seen as the banker for many of these countries. It's not an endless supply of money, but China will invest in projects that no other country will touch. Roads, railways, thermal power plants, things like that other countries just aren't interested in investing in a lot of these Commonwealth of Independent States, certainly in Central Asia. So, as a consequence, a lot of countries, not just in the former Soviet space, but around the world, have run up huge debts to China. This is also hard to detach. You would have to be willing to pay off a substantial portion of your debt before you could tell the Chinese that you weren't interested in having them help you out or be a partner anymore in some of these projects, whatever endeavors that you're trying to get. And again, just to emphasize the fact that China will invest in projects that no one else will touch. that are really important for a lot of these countries. I'll name Tajikistan since we were talking about that. China built the thermal power plant, a new thermal power plant in Dushanbe. It was $360 million. No other country or company is going to build that kind of is going to take on that kind of project. There's no profit in it for them at all. The Tajik government's got a bad reputation for corruption, so there's a lot of minuses in dealing with Tajikistan that the Chinese are willing to take on to the greatest extent overlook. So China's there, and until somebody else is willing to come in and say we can do the same things, but you're going to have to go by at least play by our rules for some of this.
So thank you so much for unpacking all this. It's a very complicated issue. So thank you for helping us shed some light. Appreciate it. And thanks again for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Cheers. And now we're moving on to the Eastern Newsflash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine drags on, the number of Ukrainian refugees planning to return home is decreasing. Persistent conflict and safety concerns are causing many displaced Ukrainians to reconsider their options, prolonging their stay abroad.
Asked about the conditions necessary for their return, the Ukrainian refugees identified as priorities the reconstruction of the necessary infrastructure, providing security, access to housing, and ending the full-scale invasion. Since 2022, the number of Ukrainians who do not plan to return from abroad has increased significantly. In a previous survey, as many as 93% of Ukrainian refugees claimed to intend to return after the end of the war. The survey interviewed 801 adult citizens of Ukraine who left the country after the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion on February 24, 2022. The results of the survey showed that 66% of respondents are generally satisfied with their living conditions in Germany, Poland and the Czech Republic, while 26% are dissatisfied.
Ukraine is bracing for months of power supply limitations, according to the chief of energy provider, Ukrenergo. Continuous Russian attacks on critical infrastructure have severely compromised the country's energy grid, leading to anticipated widespread electricity shortages.
Recent Russian ballistic missile attacks have caused significant damage to half of Ukraine's energy system. The Russians are striving to achieve what they failed to achieve in 2022-23, plunging Ukraine into darkness. Experts and representatives of the company believe that strengthening the air defense of the country is the best way to protect Ukrainian thermal power plants, power lines and other energy facilities from Russian missile attacks. However, Ukrenergo stated it will still not be possible to completely avoid power outages in Ukraine. Energy sector's workers will most likely have to reduce electricity supply in the summer, autumn and winter until the damaged facilities are fully rebuilt.
In occupied Ukrainian territories, Russian forces are indoctrinating children with Russian values and narratives. This education initiative is part of a broader strategy to assimilate the younger generation and solidify Russian influence in these regions.
During the lessons, the Russian propaganda stresses that a woman must bear children and be obedient, while a man's duty is to defend the motherland. This is not the first case of Russian attempts to brainwash Ukrainian students. Russian collaborators in these areas are forcing the so-called volunteers of the Russian army to raise Ukrainian children as so-called patriots of Russia. In addition, they teach Russian history and language and also forcefully requalify teachers of Ukrainian language to teach Russian. In Luhansk, Ukrainian language teachers were reassigned to teaching Russian.
Kyrgyzstan is facing a significant trade deficit with China, highlighting a growing economic imbalance. The disparity underscores the challenges Kyrgyzstan encounters in its trade relations and economic policies with its powerful neighbor.
Interestingly, the trade imbalance between the two countries is significant. According to Beijing, Chinese exports to Kyrgyzstan exceeded $4 billion during this period, while Kyrgyz exports to China amounted to only $22 million. Kyrgyzstan's data for the first quarter show a different picture. The Kyrgyz National Statistic Committee reported that the total trade turnover of the country with the rest of the world amounted to $3.7 billion. Kyrgyzstan has limited capacity to address this trade imbalance. Kyrgyzstan's Ministry of Agriculture agreed to export 10,000 tons of cherries to China this year. However, the value of these exports will have little impact on reducing Kyrgyzstan's trade deficit with Beijing.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.